This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
The head of the Foreign Interference Inquiry tasked with looking into threats against our democracy has delivered her final report and made sweeping recommendations for the federal government. Despite allegations of interference rising to the level of some MPs being witting or unwitting foreign agents, Marie-Josée Hogue said nothing she has seen indicates we have traitors in Ottawa. I'm Dave Breakenridge and this is 10-3. National Post politics reporter Chris Nardi joins me to discuss some of Hogue's major findings, what she's recommended the government do, and the major threats facing our democracy. Don't forget, you can find this podcast on all of your favorite podcast platforms, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Chris, we finally got, I believe, the final report from the Foreign Interference Inquiry, or the Hogue Commission, or whatever we're going to call it on here. And, before we get into the discussion around, I guess, some of the final findings and recommendations for the federal government, I guess, firstly, let's give listeners a bit of a background in case they've forgotten why exactly we had an inquiry into foreign interference to begin with.
Well, I think the genesis of it all are actually rather significant intelligence leaks that began 2-3 years ago and started with two outlets mainly, Global News and the Globe and Mail. And information just started kind of leaking out. Intelligence agents or someone in government who had access to information that was not meant to be disclosed, but was leaking it, indicating that there was probably a malaise within the Canadian intelligence community about how little the government was doing to counter foreign interference, both before 2019 and leading up to the 2019 federal election, and then also the 2021 federal election. And those media leaks kind of compounded concerns that local, ethnic communities here in Canada had been expressing for much longer about repression that they were feeling from their governments abroad. So, for example, the Chinese government, the Indian government, Iranian government, for example. The local communities here, often dissidents within it of their governments back in their home countries, were complaining that they were getting pressures, they were getting blackmailed, they were getting pushed by them, and nothing was happening in terms of protecting them. So, as kind of the community voices added to then the intelligence leaks suggesting that the situation was way worse than the government had ever let on, it put a lot of pressure on the Trudeau government, the federal level, to dig into it more, and they really resisted it. They truly resisted this idea of a public inquiry, claiming that it would do nothing, that nothing would be able to come out because you couldn't really declassify information. Everything was so sensitive, and it was a complicated situation. It led to, former Governor General David Johnston becoming a special rapporteur. I remember on foreign interference, him making a report that kind of broadly said, most things are good, here's a few improvements, but no need for a public inquiry. That went by the wayside. Eventually, the federal government relented to the request from the opposition and launched this 16-month inquiry that led to the report that was tabled on Tuesday, January 28th.
And for people who may remember, there was a lot of discussion last year about whether there were actual traitors in government or in parliament, that there were MPs who were perhaps acting wittingly or unwittingly as foreign agents. What happened there? What was the discussion at the time about where that information came from?
So that information kind of derives from another report that was done on foreign interference just basically last year, more or less in the spring of 2024. I have to remember we're 2025 now, 2024. And so there were actually 2 or 3 other reviews on Canada's intelligence community and the government's response to foreign interference, or as we say, prevent, detect, and combat foreign interference. And one of them was by what is called the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. So that is a committee of MPs and senators of all or many parties that are come together. They receive top secret clearance and they basically, the job of this new-ish committee, it's less than a decade old, is to do reviews of Canada's intelligence infrastructure and agencies, but seen through the lens of parliamentarians. And it's supposed to be an apolitical committee. I think, generally speaking, it actually works very well as such, and it does these reviews. And so NSI COP, as it's called, published this review late last spring, I believe, that basically said that there's an unnamed list, or unnamed parliamentarians that they have found through their studies of CSIS material and other spy agency material, RCMP intelligence analysis from the Canadian government, that suggested that some parliamentarians are wittingly, semi-wittingly, or unwittingly aiding foreign states by providing them with privileged information, with sensitive information. And it was a shocking report because it specifically basically stated that there are people in the House of Commons or the Senate who are knowingly and wantingly helping potentially a hostile state and against Canadian interests. So the report in NSI COP didn't actually say the word traitors or treachery or treason, but it was comments from political leaders and even some intelligence analysts outside of government that kind of snowballed, and the word traitor kind of emerged. I think the first person to use it was Jagmeet Singh. So all political leaders except for Conservative leader Priya Qualia have obtained top secret clearance after these reports were published in order to read a classified version of the NSI COP report that had more details. And Jagmeet Singh came out of there saying he was shocked, he was jarred. And when he was asked, are these individuals traitors to Canada, he said, I think so, yes, traitors. And so it has kind of snowballed. The word traitors was never in the NSI COP report, but what was gleaned from it and from statements from other people who read the classified material, some said they are traitors, and that's kind of how it snowballed into the Hogue report feeling like it needed to address that finding.
Yeah, and I mean, that took up a lot of the oxygen in the discussion that I saw on social media and all the headlines yesterday. We're recording this on Wednesday. The report was out Tuesday. Was that there are no traitors in Parliament, and traitors in quotation marks in many headlines. What did Commissioner Hogue say about the discrepancy there, or say about the existence of unwitting or witting foreign agents in Parliament?
So she said a number of things, and admittedly in this very, very, very long report, so I'll get to give the listeners an idea. The executive summary of this final report is 124 pages. That's the condensed version. The entire report is 7 volumes, and I was calculating, I think it's just under 900 pages in total. So, she had 16 months to write this. I think the rule is that if you have a little amount of time, you write long. If you have a lot of time, you can write short. So she definitely went long, but she has some rather stark words for the NSI COP report in general. So first of all, she says there are no traitors. Like I said, the word traitors never found its way into that report. It was the implication and the interpretation of what was in the unclassified NSI COP report that led to that. But she said there's nothing in NSI COP's both report and in the underlying information that NSI COP studied that ever suggested that any current parliamentarians of any stripe are even close to traitors. But it's a little bit of a deflection too, in a way, or maybe it's kind of a smoke show in the sense that to be a traitor means you've committed treason. Treason is an extraordinarily high bar. Mm-hmm. You basically have to have fomented revolt, in Canada. It's an extremely high legal bar, and I don't think it's necessarily the legal bar that the average Canadian or the public is looking for, or even the intelligence agencies are looking for when they're trying to assess if a parliamentarian is potentially wrongfully aiding a hostile state against Canada. And she does say that, I guess, to summarize it a little bit crudely, it does sound like some of the parliamentarians in the intelligence that NSI COP looked at are acting somewhat let's say, useful idiots. They're aiding, whether they're knowingly or not against Canada's interests, they are aiding foreign states. They just may not realize it. They may not realize that they're being used. But she also said that the NSI Cop report, after looking at the information that they studied, made some basic mistakes. For example, it kind of took two intelligence reports that the committee thought were talking about the same thing, and they summarized it in their report, but got the country wrong, the country that the individual that's alluded to in the report was talking to. And they said in other cases, CSIS got information wrong. They thought that a parliamentarian was meeting a foreign state representative to share privileged information, but then CSIS never realized that both it was information that was privileged at one point, but had since been disclosed publicly by the government. So by the time this individual was sharing this information with a foreign state member, it wasn't privileged anymore. It had been publicly confirmed. Mm-hmm. So it's not, we're not, it'd be like reading the newspaper and telling someone from the Chinese consulate about what you read in the newspaper. It could have at one point been privileged information, but it wasn't anymore. So she threw cold water, I'd say, on the NSI Cop report. And there's somewhat of an irony that the head of NSI Cop, the chair at the time, is now the public safety minister, David McGuinty. We haven't heard yet, as of Wednesday, what he thinks of her thoughts on that in a press conference.
We'll be right back. As you mentioned, it's a huge report, lots to potentially discuss, and obviously we don't have time to discuss every finding or every recommendation in here. But looking at broad strokes, what were kind of the main takeaways for you in terms of what Commissioner Hogue found about the existence of foreign interference in Canada and systemically how we're dealing with it as a country?
So she found that foreign interference by foreign states absolutely exists. It's existed for quite a while. And she said that the federal government took too long to acknowledge that, to recognize it, and to act against it. She says that the 2019 and 2021 elections were, in her words, tainted by foreign interference. And she did mention, a little bit more than a handful, but a small number of ridings in either of those elections that were affected by foreign interference, where the results may have been affected either in the nomination race stage or even at the election stage, where the result may have been, let's say, tainted again by foreign interference. But overall, neither the 2019 or 2021 federal elections results were at all affected. The ultimate result, the who formed government, which parties in opposition, none of that would have been changed were it not for foreign interference. That being said, she said the government is very, very, very bad at communicating what it knew about foreign interference. She was actually very critical of how little the government has communicated about it, how slow it was to recognize it, and has since kind of highlighted that significant changes have been made internally to how intelligence agencies and government departments talk to each other and communicate information, because there was a lot of situations where crucial information about foreign interference attempts were destined for, let's say, ministers or even the prime minister, but never got there because there was no follow-up. There was no checking by the people sending the information up that it was actually getting to the destination. And so ultimately, she makes 51 recommendations, 24 of which, so nearly half, she says could and should be implemented before the next federal election, which is a daunting task because the next federal election could be by the end of March, right? Parliament's prorogued until March 24th. And if all opposition parties hold to their promise of making the Liberal government fall at the earliest opportunity, that could be by the end of March, early April. So it's a very short time frame to put in place these 24-odd recommendations, which don't require legislation. But she says the government needs to act fast. It needs to act faster. And its response to foreign interference as a whole has been unsatisfactory to her, but there has been improvements since the beginning of her work.
When she talks about the threats of foreign interference, there's been discussion about threats made against the family of MPs who are from diaspora communities. There's been talk about possible interference in nomination contests. What are the main things that she is worried about, or the biggest threats to our democracy from foreign actors?
there are two. And ironically, they're not the items that she studied the most. In fact, she argues that they're somewhat outside of the scope of her study. But the two things that worry her the most, I'd say top, existential threat is what she calls it, disinformation, and kind of maybe broader information manipulation, whether it's domestically by, people who are incentivized in Canada to create discord for any number of reasons, or foreign states that want to sow discord within Canada to be able to push a certain agenda or undermine our institutions, our governments, our democratic processes. She says disinformation is by far and by wide the thing that, colloquially keeps her up at night. It is an existential threat for Canada. And it's also an incredibly difficult thing to deal with because it's so wide in scope. Governments frequently aren't looked at as the best organization to address disinformation. The immediate claims, for example, to censorship or government censorship come to mind. But there's like this innate distrust by a lot of people when it comes to a government trying to regulate speech or disinformation or tell people what is true versus what is wrong, right? And so disinformation is kind of this thing that she says, this is what foreign states use. They will keep using it. They will increase their use of it to try to undermine our society and then benefit themselves by taking advantage of that discord. The other thing that she talks about that really worries her is what she calls, quote, the scourge of transnational repression. So the example that you mentioned earlier, Conservative MP Michael Chong, and concerns that the People's Republic of China was sniffing around his family in Hong Kong to learn more about them, and the intent was unclear, but there were concerns about their safety because he had been such a vocal opponent of the Chinese regime and its treatment of its Uyghur minority. And so transnational, that would be an example, a very mild example of transnational repression, but the Iranian diaspora talks about it a lot. The Chinese diaspora talks about it a lot. This notion, or the Indian, obviously the Sikh diaspora speaks about it even more these days. It's this idea that foreign states are using coercion, threats, blackmail, or even in the Indian government, allegedly murder, to silence critics, to force them to come back to their home country or their country of origin to face the music in a sense and be repressed. And transnational repression is something she didn't study, but she mentions very clearly, this is a real problem. It's a growing problem. It is unacceptable, and it is a scourge, and we need to fight this better.
And when you say that she raised a number of recommendations that she feels the government could implement before the next federal election, which is tricky as Parliament isn't sitting and we could see an election sooner rather than later, and the Liberals are bogged down in their own leadership race. What is it she hopes that the federal government can do before we go to the polls?
It's a very wide range of recommendations, and some of them are rather broad, but I can give certain examples. Like, for example, she wants, direction. She wants CSIS, for example, so our Canadian Spy Agency, to develop mechanisms to flag reports. This is kind of internal communication of threats. CSIS to develop a way to basically better ensure that information that it views as important and sensitive flows upwards towards, department heads, towards ministers, towards the Prime Minister, but mostly ensuring that it actually gets there, which, as I said earlier, has been a reoccurring problem over the last few years, where CSIS and the RCMP and other agencies will make these assessments, say, oh, we've spotted something, there's a real problem here. They send it up, but somewhere in the 1,000-step process that is government, it gets lost and doesn't make it to the ears that need to hear it. So she talks about ensuring that these things are sent up. There's a talk about making sure or encouraging all leaders of parties in the House of Commons to obtain a top secret clearance so that they can also receive top secret briefings. Almost all leaders in the House of Commons currently have done that. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has refused to. He argues that it would gag him, basically bind him to silence. He could receive information but wouldn't be able to act on it. That has been in itself controversial. The other leaders of other parties have called hogwash on that, but that is a recommendation that she makes, that all of them should receive that. And so there's kind of a lot of recommendations, the quick get them done before the next election. They're all kind of like administrative changes and recommendations, changing in protocols, setting up the elections monitoring task force so that it's actually running all the time permanently, not just during elections, so that it could always be watching. Those are some of the changes. And then some of the more thorough ones would include legislative changes, more complex things that whoever forms the next government is going to have to tackle.
And lastly, we talked about a handful of politicians earlier. We talked about Jagmeet Singh, who first used the word traitors. We talked about Pierre Poilievre, who had been criticized previously for not getting security clearance to view some of these documents. And then we talked about David McGuinty, who was the head of NSI COP, who's now the public safety minister. What have we heard from the various parties on this? There's obviously a lot of things that are entangled here, past comments, past stances, and then this report. Do we get a sense of where the parties all sit with what Commissioner Hogue has said?
They mostly recognize and thank her for her work. The Liberals yesterday, in a statement, didn't commit to implementing all the recommendations. They said they would study them. Ironically, David McGuinty, the public safety minister, co-signed that statement, saying that, they didn't commit to implementing. They mostly just kind of vaunted the work that they've already done to address the risk as it's kind of been coming to light through the public hearings of the inquiry. The Conservatives thanked Hogue for the report, also kind of said that they were studying it. They also kind of slipped in a statement trying to, I guess, kind of make less headway of this news that Pierre Poilievre would be refusing these threat reduction measure briefings that had been promised to him because he says he was once again told that he wouldn't be able to discuss these things that were told to him in the briefing, even if he didn't get top secret clearance. Again, it's a complex issue for the Conservatives right now, so they didn't actually, I think, want to bring too much attention to it. But they did say that they thanked Hogue for a report and would consider the next steps, again, if they form government possibly in the next few months. And the NDP took a particular view where they actually just basically criticized Pierre Poilievre for being close to Elon Musk. It was a very weird 1-2 sentence, 1-line statement that didn't really get to the heart of the matter, which was surprising. And then Liz May, the Green leader, was interesting because she was one of the leaders who, at the time of the NSI Comp report, read the full redacted report and came out saying there are no traitors in Parliament. This is overblown. Let's not freak out about this. The issue is not overblown. And a lot of kind of the words or the message that she had used at the time was what Hogue wrote in her report. There's a problem. Let's not overblow it. And the NSI COP report, by kind of identifying what people thought to be traitors, may have actually created a crisis of confidence toward the government and done more damage than good. And so Liz May actually took a little bit of a victory lap, but that's kind of broadly the political thoughts and reactions on that report.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot there for Canadians to read, even your reporting and past reporting on the issue. I think it's a fascinating topic. I'm curious to see how this all plays out in the next few weeks. Chris, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Chris Nardi. More from him at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.